Hello and welcome to Silicon Alley Podcast. Super excited you could join me today. I'm William Glass, CEO and co-founder of Upstate, and of course, your host of the Silicon Alley Podcast. Now, on the Silicon Alley Podcast, I talk to entrepreneurs and top performers to understand what it truly takes to grow and scale a business. You'll get actionable advice that you can apply in your own business and life. Now, on today's episode, I sit down with Martin Babinec, founder and former CEO and chairman of TriNet, which generates over $4 billion in revenue annually and can be found on the New York Stock Exchange under ticker TNET. Before I jump into what you can expect on today's episode, if you have not already, please make sure to subscribe and follow the Silicon Alley Podcast wherever you're listening to this so you get notified when new episodes drop every Friday. And of course, if you hear something that you like, please be sure to share the podcast with others on social media, text, email, or however you prefer. Today's guest, Martin Babinec, is an industry titan, entrepreneur, investor, philanthropist, and now author. Martin Babinec founded TriNet, a Silicon Valley-based company in 1988, serving as CEO for 20 years and continues as a large shareholder and board director. TriNet's cloud-based HR services now cover 17,000 clients, generating over $4 billion in annual revenues, and is listed on the New York Stock Exchange under ticker TNET. Relocating to his hometown of Little Falls, New York, Martin founded and has an active role with UpVentures Capital, StartFast Ventures, and nonprofits Upstate Venture Connect, Entrepreneurs Across Borders, UpMobility Foundation, and the Upstate Jobs Party. He is a past recipient of the SVBT Silicon Valley Entrepreneur of the Year Award, and his book, More Good Jobs, was published by Lion Crest in October 2020. Martin has experienced the ups and downs of entrepreneurship, overcoming tremendous obstacles, and now is on a mission to change the trajectory of an entire region, that of upstate New York. So on today's episode, Martin discusses the two contrasting valleys, no, not alleys, but valleys with a V, those being Silicon Valley and the Mohawk Valley in upstate New York. You'll hear the challenges that Martin overcame at the helm of TriNet, leading through the boom and bust of the dot-com bubble, and how he overcame a failed IPO attempt, ultimately leading the company to over $1 billion annual revenues before passing on the reins. Martin shares some of the keys to his success and what is necessary to build a strong startup community. His book, More Good Jobs, outlines the keys to building a tribe and ultimately how to change an entire economic region. So without further ado, I hope that you enjoyed today's tribe building episode of the Silicon Alley Podcast featuring the Martin Babinec.
You got no time to waste, but still you hesitate. Caught in a circle saying, I'll never leave this place.
And welcome to the Silicon Alley Podcast. Super excited to have you on today.
I'm excited to be here, William. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you've got a really awesome track record and story. And I'm really excited about the book that you just published. So I want to get into that. But before we kind of jump into that, you, in the intro of More Good Jobs, which is the title of the book that just launched October 20th. So definitely want to check that out. In the intro, you mentioned the tale of two valleys. And there's these two valleys that are in your life. I'd love for you to talk about the contrasting valleys and tell us a little bit about what that means.
Happy to do that. As we sit right now, I am in my hometown where I grew up. And in the background here, you'll see the Mohawk River, which is running through the Mohawk Valley. And this is where I grew up. And after college, left for 25 years and boomeranged back here. But in between, spent a very important 15 years in the Silicon Valley, where I started TriNet, which has now grown to be a very large public company, and have been commuting back and forth for 10 years of the 20 years that I was TriNet's CEO. So the contrast between the Mohawk Valley and the Silicon Valley is so significant that over the course of that 10-year commute, I spent a lot of time thinking about those differences and noting that the Mohawk Valley, with a lot of assets in one sense that should be powering the growth of more innovation economy startups, and yet there is a scarcity of that here versus the abundance in the Silicon Valley. And that's really one of the things that set the stage for the story behind the More Good Jobs book.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I think that that's something that we connected. And I know Brad Feld wrote the forward, I believe, for the book. And, he's really big about building startup communities. And obviously that's exactly where you play. So I'm excited to dive into that, especially with the audience being entrepreneurs and in the entrepreneurial space. Before we do that, though, can you talk a little bit about how that contrast and the contrast between Mohawk Valley and Silicon Valley led you to start TriNet and ultimately build that for 20 plus years into now being over a $4 billion company and public company?
Sure. Well, after college, the work that I did involved working for the U.S. Navy as a civilian and spending most of that time outside the U.S. And by the time I returned, almost 8 years later, the fact was I was unemployable. Nobody wanted to hire me because I had worked for the government for too long. And as a consequence, I spent a lot of time looking around for entrepreneurial opportunities within the field of human resources, because that's really what my background was. And I was very lucky in the late 80s to stumble across what was just then emerging as a category of services, that being today what is known as the professional employer organization industry, an industry that I helped start. And while there were a few other firms there ahead of me, we ended up starting this as a small business, not with an ambition to be a big company, but just to create a small business, and not realizing at the time, we're talking 1988, not realizing that in essence, it wasn't a small business, it was a startup. And the reason I say it was a startup and I didn't know it is that the very nature of what we were creating with TriNet was an innovation that the market was just not ready to embrace yet, because the idea of bundling a whole bunch of small and mid-sized companies into one group and then sharing in the relationship of being an employer to take all the headaches of being an employer off their shoulders, that was a pretty radical idea in the late 80s. And even through the 90s, it was just not understood by the marketplace. So it was an innovation. That's an important element for what's the difference between a startup and a small business. And the second element of an innovation economy company would be the fact that even though I was beginning the company thinking, I'll just be the best professional employer organization in San Leandro, California, sell to local small businesses, we ended up making a decision fairly early on to specialize and focus our target market on emerging growth technology companies. And as a result, that brought me into the world of Silicon Valley and really made me appreciate the opportunities that were so different in working with other startup companies and investors compared to the small business cycle or small business community. And so an innovation economy company is also one that is creating a product or a service aimed at a national or global audience. So again, when I began, I was thinking small business, I'm just going to sell to businesses in my local community. But when I got into that, as soon as we made the decision that we're going to be helping to support startup companies, and startup companies started hiring people in other states, then as an employer, we had to build the capability to service eventually all 50 states. Yeah. And there's a lot of complexity in that. As a result, it is about having the infrastructure in terms of systems, processes, people. There's a lot of stuff that goes along with serving a national audience. And that put us on the path then to raise money and truly go on the startup path. But when I began, it was with the vision of a small business.
That's interesting how that changed. And it sounds like that one decision to focus on technology companies really changed the trajectory of the entire business. What was that decision like? Was it something that was obvious at the time, or is it looking back, that's kind of the pivot point? Do you like, how exactly did that take form?
The decision to go narrow in a choice of a vertical was a very counterintuitive decision. And what I mean by that is when you're building a business whose basis is scale, you generally don't want to do anything that will eliminate who your customer is going to be. So the very nature of the business that we started, we knew we had to have as many small business customers as we could possibly get, as quickly as we could get them. And oftentimes with startups today, this is the ambition. We want every customer we can get as fast as we can get them. We were feeling that pressure. We were not successful in the first year and a half. This was a really slow, difficult climb because we were out ahead of the market. This was not yet understood by the market. And so making the decision to narrow the focus and be just looking at a very defined vertical was counterintuitive, but it was driven by the fact that we were running out of money. We weren't going to sell our way out of it. And the only way we were going to be successful in being able to keep the lights on was coming up with a strategy that could appeal to investors. And that's what put me on this path to think through the model. If I'm an investor, what would make me think that TriNet was worth investing in when for the last year and a half, the company is not showing much traction? And so we completely reformulated the strategy with this focus, raised in our very first round of financing a grand total of $50,000, which today doesn't sound like much, but it's the difference between going out of business and my being here today to tell that story. All right. So, all right. On my blog at babinec.com, we have a post, choosing your vertical market focus, that goes into some background on what were the factors that led to that decision. But in general, it's safe to say that without that decision, I wouldn't be here right now having this discussion.
Yeah, exactly. So that $50,000 that doesn't look like a lot was the difference between a whole lot of success and in a 20+ year business, and continuing obviously running now that you've stepped out of running the business. But yeah, that's when you put it in that context, it shows those small moments and those little things that may not seem significant, but ultimately in the long run are.
Yes.
So you are in Silicon Valley. You're now immersed in this world. Your clients are also technology companies. You go through this process where you are planning an IPO, and something happens that throws off the initial IPO. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Sure. To backtrack just a little bit, starting the company in the late 80s, making that shift towards emerging tech as the only focus of our company, and throughout the entire 90s, emerging tech and the companies that supported them, VCs and service providers that help support startups, was our exclusive target market. And as you know from history, the dot-com era kind of kicked off in the 95 timeframe, because up until that time, we didn't have the World Wide Web as we know it today. And through the second half of the 90s, we were growing like gangbusters at TriNet. It was a fantastic place to work if you were in the sales side at TriNet. If you were on the operations side, trying to manage all that work with systems that we were trying to update and really improve, it was a bigger challenge. So we decided in 1999, at the very height of the dot-com era, to file an IPO. And in the summer of 99, knowing this was right around the corner, I actually made the decision to move my family back to upstate New York and commute what I thought then would be for an 18-month period. And March 3rd, 2000, we filed to go public. If you know your dot-com history, you know that the absolute peak of the market happened on March 15th. And after March 15th, the air started to come out of the bubble, and the whole dot-com era ended and kind of evolved to the dot bomb. And as fast as we grew through the 90s, after that, it started to really go down. And so by the time we actually went out on the road show in October of 2000, the enthusiasm for having public company investors put money in a company that was selling pickaxes and shovels to the dot-com companies where 99% of our revenue was no longer a great story. So we ended up aborting the IPO in 2000 after we went through the roadshow, and then had to go through that painful period of retrenchment. It was not something I'd wish on anyone, but with a team that was very committed and a lot of lessons learned in going through that, we persevered and eventually not only grew our way out of that organically without having to raise additional money at that point, and brought our company up to a place where we were then viable and growing, and then took on some financial partners, new financial partners in 2005. But it was a very difficult period.
Yeah, I mean, that cannot be easy. Is there anything from that period that really helped you get through that, whether both on the business side and the personal side, having moved your family back to upstate New York and then, plans falling through? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it reflects well with what's currently going on with the pandemic and the challenges that businesses are facing today.
Sure. On the business side, the experience that I went through in the dot-bomb era has a lot of parallels to what companies are struggling with today in the pandemic. And I've written about that also on my blog in a series I call Wartime Leadership. In fact, I went back and looked at it again this morning and realized that my first post in that series was on April 5th. And what I said in that post was, we lack clarity on the timing and duration of the downturn and recovery. All right. It's like we didn't know. Remember back in April, at that point, we were thinking pandemic, we could be out of this in a couple of months. All right. Yeah. And here we are now in October, it ain't over yet. And and when you're in wartime, the other lesson learned, and again, painful for me and painful for companies struggling with this today, you have to throw out all of your peacetime priorities. It's a whole new ballgame, because in wartime, only one thing matters, and that is survival. Surviving, having the company survive is the only thing that matters. So I went through a whole series of very hard decisions driven by our trying to get very realistic about our cash forecasting. And that has to drive the very difficult decisions that have to be made. And not only reducing the team, but then the hard part about leadership is deciding what's the right composition of the wartime leadership team. And so what you need during peacetime is maybe a different team when you think about it than what you need during wartime, where survival is your only priority. These are hard, hard decisions. And again, I'm a lucky guy, and I'll be the first to say that the people that stuck with TriNet during that very difficult period is the reason the company survived and thrives today. Because when a ship is sinking, people leave, and people who have the best talent are the ones that find other jobs. And when you can keep the company's best talent through difficult times, then you have the opportunity to thrive coming out the other end of whatever that difficult period is. So those are important things from the business perspective that I've had the good fortune of working through and surviving, and I've tried to share that in that Wartime Leadership series. And that which does not kill you will make you stronger. There's a lot of truth to that, all right? And something that we were later given credit for when we did go back out into the investor market and try to raise funds. We were given a lot of credit for having turned the ship around under very demanding and challenging circumstances. And most other companies that were serving .com customers during that area did not survive. So those are all business lessons learned. And on the personal side, it was without a doubt the most challenging. But when I was commuting during that period, I was probably on the road, somewhere in the area of 15 to 18 days a month. So I was not at home. And, no matter which coast I was on or which valley I was in, Mohawk Valley or Silicon Valley, somebody was wishing I was in the other valley. All right. It was very hard. But I was so fortunate with my wife and my family being supportive. We had young kids, but a big reason we moved from Silicon Valley to my hometown of Little Falls was to be surrounded by our extended family. My wife, Krista, is also from upstate New York. So the opportunity to get family support when I wasn't here was a very big factor. And our kids really did well. I mean, it's a challenging thing for a dad, but I had my own routines about staying in touch. And even though I wasn't physically here, really made sure that I knew what was happening every single day. So long commutes like that are not something I'd recommend. Over the years, the number of days I was away tapered down, but it all worked out. I'm pleased to say this year we celebrated our 40th year of marriage, Krista and I, and our kids have all done well. In fact, sequestered here for 7 months in our home. So they still think enough of us to kind of hang out here as they left New York City and Saratoga Springs to come and spend the time with us.
Yeah. Well, congratulations. And that says something about being able to not only build a huge business, which, in our society, we tend to look at just the career and finance side for success. But I think that being able to maintain those family relationships and also have your kids want to come back home and spend a lot of time with you is a great testament to the personal side as well and personal success. Martin, you brought it up earlier, and I want to come back to this when you were first talking about the differences between Silicon Valley and Mohawk Valley. And you were talking about how when you look at Mohawk Valley, that there is all the resources, the things that you think a place needs in order to build a thriving startup ecosystem. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect and sort of what are those things when you think about building strong startup communities? What are some of those key characteristics that you see, and we'll lead that into sort of how we can build those and build strong startup communities?
Sure. Well, in the 10 years I commuted and spending all those hours on planes, I did spend a lot of time thinking about the difference between these two valleys. And when I say the Mohawk Valley, I mean also the greater region of upstate New York. And when we think about that region, the assets we have here, which are formidable, include first, the colleges and universities. We have more than 100 colleges and universities across upstate New York. Collectively, they enroll more than 500,000 college students. And within that, wow, as a STEM program, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, we have the largest concentration of STEM programs as a region of any place in the country. Upstate New York has more than $3.5 billion a year in corporate and academic research going on. So lots of R&D, all right, including on the corporate side from companies that at one time were powerhouses of innovation that got started right here in upstate New York. Companies like GE, IBM, Xerox, Kodak, Corning, all these companies got started here in upstate New York and had strong technical teams and had a huge amount of innovation and were entrepreneurial successes of 100 years ago in some cases, all right? And so those assets, along with the fact there's a lot of money, all right, in terms of there's wealth that's been created through industry all around upstate New York. And think of the close proximity that upstate has to New York Metro, not only because there's access to the capital markets in New York Metro, but over the years, more and more of our top talent left upstate, landed in New York Metro. And so there are both personal and institutional ties with upstate and New York Metro. And you put all that together, in my mind, we should be creating tens of thousands of new startups a year with those kind of assets, all right? Those are the right assets to build a startup community. So 10 years, I'm going back and forth saying, why the heck are we so low in the amount of venture capital in upstate New York? So many people are aware that New York State is number 2 in venture capital, trailing only California. But if you were to guess how much of that venture capital goes upstate versus New York Metro on a percentage basis, William, what would your guess be?
I mean, I'd guess it's got to be what, 90, 95% it's got to be New York Metro.
So you're more informed than most. All right. You are correct.
Okay.
It actually runs about 98 to 99%. Yes. So it's a little higher than most people would not even guess it was above 90. All right. So you're informed because of part of what you do. Okay. And so for me, that level of imbalance, given what I described earlier as the assets that we have, there's something wrong with that picture.
Yeah.
And so I'm an entrepreneur. And what do entrepreneurs do? We see this gap in a market that other people don't yet see. And then we're crazy enough to think we can do something about it. All right. So for 10 years, I'm going back and forth saying, I'm only one guy. What the heck could I do to change that equation? Because there's something wrong with that picture. And that's what put me on this path to say, we got the assets. What can I, as one guy, do to help change that imbalance?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question and really interesting, that you're in the Silicon Valley where you have all these resources and where, the tech world blossomed from, and then coming back to Mohawk Valley and seeing where, if you go back, 50 or 100 years, where the other large companies came from, right? When you talk about GE and Kodak and some of these other businesses. So how do you, as you mentioned, as an entrepreneur, as one person seeing something that it has a huge imbalance, 98% venture capital in New York State goes to New York Metro, how do you as one individual start to solve such a large problem?
Well, it begins with going back to what makes Silicon Valley, or the other places that are, what in the book we call them magnet cities, because they attract talent to move there to take advantage of the abundance of opportunities in the newer industries that are based on innovation. So as young talent graduates from our colleges and universities, and again, we have an abundance of that in upstate New York, we wave goodbye to the vast majority of that talent after they graduate. So how do we change that? How do we get more of them, including those that could be brave enough to be starting companies while they're in college or shortly thereafter? And the more that I thought about the differences between my two valleys, the more that I realized that the support of the community is what really makes the difference. And in thinking about what makes Silicon Valley, the areas that don't get enough press have more to do with culture than anything else. Because many times, even entrepreneurs that decide to move to Silicon Valley, they go, well, that's where the money is. And it's like, well, yeah, there's money there, but why do you think there's all that money there being invested in startups? What got there before the VCs, all right? And there's an ethos in not only Silicon Valley, but in places now developing much along these lines. New York Metro is like this, and Boston, Austin, Texas, and as we profile in the book, Boulder, Colorado being another great example. These are magnet cities that attract people to move there to take advantage of the abundance of opportunities in the innovation economy. And the ethos in these cities has to do with the willingness of especially experienced entrepreneurs to be out there helping the next generation. And I give a lot of examples of that in the book that include how, as a newbie entrepreneur, I got helped by people that in some cases I would meet just at an event, and I will only be talking to them for 5 minutes, and they go over and introduce me to somebody that could potentially be a TriNet customer, or maybe somebody else that could be an investor. And compare that with the Northeast, especially in that same time period, the likelihood of that happening was really low, because there's a tendency in what we call talent exporting communities in the book. In talent exporting communities, oftentimes the people that have the power and the influence are so concerned about their reputation, they don't want to go out and introduce someone that they haven't really qualified and really don't have a relationship based on trust yet, why take the risk of referring somebody and put my reputation on the line? So that's a difference in ethos, which is really huge. So to step back and say, all right, in order for us to change the way we have that belief held, what can we do to start making cultural changes? The formula that really I settled on was trying to build a tribe. And we think about building a tribe, it means trying to find the right leaders who subscribe to similar values as I do, and saying, if we band together and have a long-term outlook about this, and we start working together, we can change this. It doesn't have to be this way. And importantly, in upstate New York's case, that means not just one community, but we have 7 distinct metro areas across upstate New York. And it meant developing nodes on a network so that the opportunity for that tribe to grow could include crossing geographic boundaries and institutional boundaries. That's the approach that we took in trying to develop one relationship at a time to build that tribe and try to have people embrace the value of what we now call give first, meaning we're out there trying to help entrepreneurs, help them be successful, and not look at it like it has to be transactional and that I'm going to help somebody in anticipation that I'm going to get something back. Now, I help enough people, believe it or not, I gotten a huge amount back, all right? But I don't go out there and make referrals and do what I can to help somebody based on a belief that I'll help you because you're going to help me.
Yeah. So how do you, Martin, get out of that very narrow transactional mindset and that sort of short-term thinking to the longer-term give first mentality? How do you start to change that mindset?
It begins with explaining how there's value in changing the thought process. If we can embrace these values of give first and work together with people that share those values, then we can actually make change. So it begins with trying to identify who are the people that are showing some evidence of those values. So I'd run around and spend a lot of time going to events in all of these 7 metro areas. And they did not always embrace me when I started showing up, but I would start showing up and I would be talking about these things, and started a nonprofit called Upstate Venture Connect that has as its mission the need for us to connect entrepreneurs in these newer industries with the resources they need to be successful. That's our mission. And to do that in a way that reduces the friction that's typically involved for that to happen. Because when people start these companies, oftentimes if they're younger and they haven't really got a widely developed network, they need lots of help. And usually the help they need is specialized, and they may not have exactly the right resource in their community, but maybe the community next door does. So being able to get more people involved in helping entrepreneurs was the mission of Upstate Venture Connect, which we're now in our 11th year. And we built a network that today numbers more than 16,000 people that are in one fashion or another connected and following us and aware of different things we do to help along these lines. But when I began and started walking around saying, this is what we're trying to do, this is our mission, there was a lot of skepticism because this was a startup. In essence, it's the same kind of thing. We're trying to do something that the market is not ready to embrace. And I had all kinds of people tell me, here are the 9 reasons why you're going to fail in this effort to create this nonprofit. All right. Just like startup entrepreneurs here, when they're trying to do this innovation that the market is not yet embraced. All right.
Yeah.
So, I'm back in the startup world again.
Yeah, just a different lens this time. So
Yes.
yeah, what is the difference? So obviously you've built a very successful for-profit business, taken it public, had a ton of success on that front. What's it like building a nonprofit this time and looking at it from that entrepreneurial lens?
It's the same kind of challenge. All right. It's in some ways a nonprofit startup is even harder unless you are able to get a lot of financial support to build a team. So we've kind of tended to be very guerrilla. We don't have a large team in Upstate Venture Connect. It's a small team, but we've concentrated hard on trying to build awareness and engagement. So we have two main themes on building a tribe. All right. Yeah. And the first is that if you want to increase the connectivity with the target audience, then we want to scale up the volume and quality of what we call creative collisions. And we talk a lot about this in the book, where there are ways to drive awareness of, hey, what meetings are going on with certain themes, and how can you spread awareness of those events and meetings and content so that someone who is trying to start a company in cybersecurity, for example, for the right meeting, they might drive a 2-hour or 3-hour distance just to attend that meeting because it's got exactly the right audience that they're interested in. So if we as a nonprofit could help spread the visibility of more of those types of events, then we increase the number of creative collisions where, boom, the right person happens to stumble into somebody at that meeting. It might be a mentor, it might be a team member, it might be an investor, it might be a service provider, but it's somebody who has a common affinity that's important for that entrepreneur. And then the second theme within Upstate Venture Connect, and profiled in detail in the book, has to do with scaling up the volume and quality of referral by trusted source. That's the second theme. So what happens then? Now you got two people that have met each other as a result of a creative collision, and they start nurturing a relationship. When that happens, let's say it's an entrepreneur has now met an experienced entrepreneur, a startup entrepreneur meets an experienced entrepreneur who's providing some mentoring. A relationship deepens over time. That experienced entrepreneur is then in a position to make referrals because that experienced entrepreneur has a wider array of a network with resources that'll be useful to the startup entrepreneur. And so the more that we can make it easy for the people who are experienced and have deep networks to connect with people who are startup entrepreneurs, the more that we can scale up that number of referrals made. And that's really what helps the startup entrepreneurs. So we've thought through different programs on how to do that. And that's a big chunk of what's in More Good Jobs. So we cover the different categories of nonprofits, government, higher ed, business leaders. We cover the different categories of where are their resources in communities and how can you get them engaged with strategies that will help increase creative collisions and referral by trusted source.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I like that approach of promoting those, as you call them, creative collisions. When I think back to some of the events and things that I've attended, it's been those sort of random happenings or connections with people that you weren't expecting or anticipating that often lead to some of the best relationships, advice, things like that have helped, I know, me personally on my entrepreneurial journey. So that makes a lot of sense. In, the context of the pandemic, what has that looked like, and what is your advice, and how are you approaching establishing those creative collisions in a very virtual first world that we're in at the moment?
That has absolutely been a challenge. There's no question about it. But we've had to pivot just like companies have. And what we've done is really tried to emphasize the opportunities that are there, even with virtual meetings. As an example, coming up on November 12th, we have our annual conference called Upstate Unleashed, which every time we've done it the last 4 years, we've been able to sell out, bringing together startup leaders and startup ecosystem leaders from around the entire region. And it's always been a tremendous creative collision opportunity and generate a lot of new relationships. So this year, because it's got to be virtual, we've been using a platform called Brella that we selected as an opportunity for us to build a program around people engaging, not just with the content, but being able to orchestrate virtual meetings through how we structure the program and then marketing that. So we invite everyone to visit uvc.org, and you've got a lot of followers right here in Silicon Alley that are New York Metro. And no matter where you are, take advantage of the opportunity to see there are some really interesting people, some speakers like Brad Feld, investors from all over, not just upstate New York, and very experienced startup entrepreneurs that have now grown to larger companies. And it's possible you can enroll and request a meeting and get a brief one-on-one introduction. In some ways, I could argue you might even have greater success at walking out with more new relationships if you invest the time up front on how to take advantage of these platforms, making sure your profile information is up to date, making sure you're actually requesting meetings in advance of the actual event. So ask me after November 12th how it went.
Absolutely, we'll do. We'll have to do a follow-up and hear how that goes. I know that I recently did my first sort of using Brella actually virtual conference, and I would say it was pretty productive. You know, the amount of one-on-ones and conversations that you can have, not quite the same, but definitely some really great conversations and relationships that came out of that. So excited to hear how that goes. What do you really hope the readers of the book take away? If they come away with maybe one or two key concepts, what are those one or two things that you hope the reader internalizes and takes with them?
Probably the most important one would be for the things that matter, for the change that someone is trying to bring about, even if it's not trying to grow more good jobs. But if someone has an ambition and say they want to try to affect a change of some kind, I hope the book will help give them a view for how to build a tribe. How do you go about identifying other people that might share in what your ambition is? What are some specific steps you can take to find leaders who might share in your ambition? How do you cultivate that? So that would be probably number one. And then number two, the importance of having a long-term commitment. Because usually when people try to do things that are hard, when they don't make much measurable progress in the first 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever the time frame is, they have a tendency to give up. And if you are going to make a commitment to do something hard, like in my case, I'm trying to make the commitment, I have made the commitment to help change the direction of an entire regional economy. Now, when I started, people said, that's impossible, all right? I like to think, as we've profiled in the book, we've been able to move the needle on that. The job's not done, but we've been able to move the needle, all right? And in order for that to happen, it has required a long-term commitment. So if readers don't come away with any other conclusion beyond you can be thoughtful about how to build your tribe, here are some steps in the playbook to think about on building your tribe, to surround yourself with people that might share in your ambition. And number two, have a long-term commitment and don't give up. Great things can happen in your ability to bring about the change that you're trying to do, including starting a company, which is why the book is, I hope, useful for entrepreneurs as well. It's not just about the people trying to create startup community.
Yeah. I think those are both really great points, Martin, and appreciate you highlighting those. I'm curious, looking at your life career up to this point, and looking to the future, obviously we've talked already about TriNet. We've talked about what you're building now and the book and all these different things, your family life. How do you define success today? Like, what does success really look like for Martin?
We actually close out the book with a conclusion section where I kind of touch on that. And you got to remember, I'm the son of a factory worker, all right? Starting with little, and I have been really blessed. There's no question about it. Blessed because of the people that have joined me on the crazy initiatives that I decided to take on. I'm just very, very lucky. So when I think about success, it really is about the impact that I can have on kind of my personal agenda of how can I make the workplace better and how can I impact other people's lives. So I don't think about success in the traditional entrepreneurial terms of, oftentimes people think about, well, how much wealth has been created. It's like, well, wealth is a responsibility. All right. Through your work with Ostrich, that there's a lot of responsibility that comes with wealth. All right. And helping people understand that is a big deal. So I've really tended to focus on looking at success in terms of what's the impact? Why am I here? What's my life about? What am I trying to achieve with my life? And it's not an end game. It's a journey. So for me, the reward is really the journey, because I love what I do. I love getting up every day and thinking about, hey, what do I have this range of opportunities, at least by being financially independent. What it gives me is the freedom to put my time where I want. Yeah. And then that creates this desire to be thoughtful about how to get the impact that I'm seeking, while still feeling that mantle of responsibility of, to whom much has been given, much is expected. And I really do believe that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I appreciate you espousing that and talking from your experience. And I love the journey view of it, and really looking at the impact that you're making on all these different levels. Martin, as you've mentioned, and we talked about before we hopped on, Ostrich, financial well-being is really important to me. I'd love to kind of wrap up with some quick rapid fire type questions. Could you describe your relationship with money today?
I think about wealth as responsibility, all right, and the opportunity to have impact. And so I try to be thoughtful about how can I use resources that I've got to achieve the aims that I have in mind from an impact standpoint. And so I do put some energy into managing that and to also rely upon others to help me. But I've learned over a longer period of time, it's not something that I just started working on the last couple of years. So I would say probably more than anything else, I don't let money rule me, all right? But rather I feel it as a responsibility to manage whatever resources I have, and I have throughout my life.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's a great way to frame it. As you said, now, wealth is a responsibility, and how you champion that and support the initiatives that are important to you and giving back. So I love that framework. What would you say is the best investment that you've made?
Well, starting TriNet, if you just say, without a doubt. And it's not just money, but we think about investment in terms of also where do we choose to put our time, all right? And so when you make your financial commitment and then where you're going to put your energy, and if you can align those, as I try to do, obviously I do invest a lot in philanthropy, where I can't be involved with every single contribution that I make. But I've also created a family foundation, and we're just thoughtful about, in the larger checks, to put time into certain things that we can actually influence the direction of causes by where we put our time in addition to where we write checks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that time investment, not just the monetary aspect, I think is crucial. on the flip side, we're not perfect, right? So I'm curious, what's one of the dumbest money mistakes that you've made?
Well, I can't say that there's a single dumb decision that stands out, because obviously I've made investments that didn't work out. But what I will say to counterbalance that is that I've always had an eye for having diversification. So no matter what stage I was at, I always looked at not putting all my eggs in one basket, beyond like TriNet. When you start off, you got to put all the chips forward into a startup. All right. And mine was no exception. But once we got past the stage of the company's survivability being in question, once we got past that, then I've always been with an eye for diversification. And so that's what's helped take the sting out of bad decisions. Because if you're diversified, then, all right, you can afford to take, there will be, with risk, you're going to have some things that aren't going to work out.
Yeah.
And then you can offset that with the things that do.
Absolutely. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. And yeah, don't want to get stuck in one area and one bad decision that kind of sinks your whole ship. So that's a good way to look at it. And then I'm sure this probably ties into what we've been talking about today in the book, but in terms of the biggest challenge facing Americans when it comes to finances, what are your thoughts on that?
I would say, as I think about those that I've run into that have had struggles with finances, and typical patterns that I see that could be avoided, is that too many people don't keep track of their spending. All right. And they don't, by not tracking it, then they're not keeping control of what do they spend versus what do they earn. And it sounds kind of basic. Well, I should spend less than I earn, but most people don't do that. All right. That's the number one problem. And today, with the availability of tools that are out there, including through Ostrich, and you think about mint.com, there's like all these online tools. It's so easy, but it requires some discipline. That's probably the number one thing. And then obviously, when you are going to spend less than you earn, it also means, do you have the wherewithal to delay short-term gratification? Because we all want that next vacation or that new car, or whatever the ambition is. There's the needs are always going to be greater than the resources. All right. Yeah. And so being able to delay short-term gratification made such a difference. And even our getting to a stage when we started TriNet, we had already had a little bit of a nest egg that permitted us to buy a house and buying a house in the Bay Area at the time that we did, at the income level I was at, was a really big stretch. Yeah. But we delayed gratification in early years of our marriage. And so we had a little bit of a nest egg to be able to do that then set the stage for having enough resources to start a company and take some risk. Yeah. Those are hard things to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I agree with everything that you just said. It definitely makes sense. Just the simplicity of don't spend first off more than you're earning. That's the number one rule. If you can get that right, the rest you can figure out. Yeah. But if you don't get that part right, it's really hard to set yourself up for success financially. Martin, I want to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate you sharing your story, talking about the lessons that you've learned, and sharing the book and what all you're doing with Upstate New York and creating a thriving, robust startup community. I want to leave you with the last word. Please let us know how we can find the book, where we can connect with you offline, and again, whatever final words you want to share with the audience.
Sure. The book is accessible through our website, moregoodjobs.org, where you can request a free chapter. You can take a look at the introduction, table of contents. You can buy the book on Amazon. And you can also join our community site through that moregoodjobs.org. That's the best way to contact me, and invite people to also visit Upstate Venture Connect at uvc.org. Think about coming to our November 12th virtual conference and connect with startup leaders in the ecosystem. So I really appreciate your being here and having me go through the sharing of this story.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's great to hear your perspective and insights that you've learned along the way. So Martin, thank you again so much for sitting down today.
All right. Thanks, William.
That's it for today's episode of the Silicon Alley podcast. I hope that you enjoyed the interview with Martin Babinec. I had a lot of fun speaking with Martin, hearing his incredible story of going from the public sector to founding and building a $1 billion plus annual revenue company. What really stuck out to me is Martin's insight around building a tribe and the impact that this key activity can have, not just on individuals and groups of people, but an entire region. So on your way out, please follow and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you are listening or watching this. And if you are on Apple Podcasts, please leave a rating and review. I love to hear your feedback, and those reviews help others find the podcast. That's it for today. I'm William Glass, CEO and co-founder of Ostrich, and of course, your host of the Silicon Alley podcast. Have a tribe building day, everyone.
You got no time to waste, but still you hesitate. Caught in a circle saying, I'll never